All right, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for being here today. We are going to go ahead and get started. All right, so hello and welcome to today's webinar, Care and Preservation of Scrapbooks and Photo Albums, which is brought to you by Georgia Homeplace, a project of the Georgia Public Library Service. My name is Angela Stanley, and I am Director of Georgia Homeplace for GPLS, and we are so pleased to be able to bring you this series on managing library, archives, and special collections, and preserving scrapbooks and photo albums. Please note that participants may join the webinar using VoIP on a computer. If you wish to connect to the webinar using your smartphone, please download the WebEx app. Today's presentation will be made available in both the GPLS Learning Center, which is available at learning.georgialibraries.org, as well as on our YouTube stream at youtube.com/user/Georgia Public Library. These links will be emailed to all participants once the recording is available. At the end of the webinar, we'll provide a link to the slides and the documents discussed. And I'm seeing here that somebody can't hear me. Can somebody else give me a thumbs up or let me know that I am being heard? Okay, good. It looks like we're having a few issues with audio for a couple of individuals. So I'm going to respond to y'all in a moment. All right. So as I mentioned at the end of the webinar, we'll be providing a link to the slides and the documents discussed, and I will be monitoring the chat box throughout the presentations, and we'll hold questions until the end. If you would like a continuing education certificate, those are available. For those participants that require it, you can contact Dorcas Davis at her email address, ddavis@georgialibraries.org. If you have feedback or suggestions at the end of the webinar, you will be forwarded to a SurveyMonkey survey. It's real quick, 3 minutes. We hope that you will take a second to fill that out and let us know how we did and if you have any suggestions for us moving forward. All right, before we get to today's presenter, I do want to take a moment to briefly share some information about Homeplace and the Digital Library of Georgia. Georgia Homeplace encourages public libraries and related institutions across the state of Georgia to participate in the Digital Library of Georgia through digital projects, trainings, and consultations. Homeplace is made possible through the support of LSTA funds administered by the Institute for Museum and Library Services. The Digital Library of Georgia is a Galileo initiative based at the University of Georgia Libraries that collaborates with Georgia's libraries, archives, museums, and other institutions of education and culture to provide access to key information resources on Georgia history, culture, and life. This primary mission is accomplished through the ongoing development, maintenance, and preservation of digital collections and online digital library resources. Please visit our websites at georgialibraries.org/homeplace, all one word, and dlg.usg.edu for more details. If you'd like to subscribe to the DLG's listserv, through which the partner newsletter is distributed quarterly, you can visit bit.ly/DLG news. These links will also be posted to the chat box shortly. If you are interested in offering a presentation that would benefit librarians managing archives and special collections, please feel free to send an email to me at astanley@georgialibraries.org. All right, and now on to today's presenter. Ann Frellsen retired after nearly 27 years as the Book and Paper Conservator for the Emory University Libraries and is teaching workshops on a variety of topics, including preservation of collections, disaster planning, emergency response and salvage of collections, and book arts. Ann also volunteers at the Museum of Papermaking, working in their rare book library and museum collections to help preserve materials. Ann is a member of the Southeastern Regional Conservation Association, or CIRCA, the Heritage Emergency Response Alliance in Atlanta, and the American Institute of Conservation, as well as the National Heritage Responders Team, which assists cultural heritage institutions affected by disaster. And if you'll bear with us for just one moment, I'm going to hand it over to Ann for her presentation. Okay, Ann, I think it's all you.
Okay, and I need to share.
Yes.
Okay, does that look all right?
Looks good.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. Because I'm sharing my screen, I cannot see the chat box. So Angela has agreed to gather all of the questions that you may have and help me out at the end with responding to your queries. So if there are problems, I guess respond to Angela, and since I can't see the chat box at the moment. So anyway, thank you, and thank you for allowing me to tell you what I know about scrapbooks and photo albums. They are indeed problematic. They are troublesome to us because they don't fit into our sort of normal procedures because they are composite objects, meaning they are full of a very complex assortment of often very incompatible materials. They're all adhered together in ways that stress their bindings, and often they interact with each other, and so they tend to cause problems with each of the precious items that the creators have assembled in order to tell a story. Scrapbooks are frequently found in archives and library collections because of their very nature. They are a visual representation of our culture, who we are, how we lived, where we lived, what we wore. They talk about our relationships to our neighbors and our communities as well as our families. So they're extremely valuable in representing who we are and where we have come from. We certainly love them as individuals, as institutional owners. We don't necessarily love them because they're difficult. And so one of the reasons we tend to avoid them is because we don't know how to deal with all of the fussy little variations of all of the media and materials that are included in them. So this is often how we find them in a box. We put it away and think we'll deal with it later, and then often we never come back. Scrapbooks are a little different than a photograph album. A photograph album technically is straight up photographs, but a scrapbook will also have a whole lot of other material added into it, whether it's paper or metal, as you can see on top of this giant feather, metal buttons and ribbons. So there's fabric, textiles, Again, organic materials, these three-dimensional bits that are pushing and pressing and piercing through things. And so it's just about anything and everything that you can imagine, and as many as I've seen, hundreds in my career, I think I'm always surprised by some of the things I find, like cake. Of course, by their nature, they are bound, and those binding styles vary. Post bindings are very common. They hold up well because of that screw post, and they're a little easier to deal with because we can just usually unscrew the screws if they're not rusty. The one on the top right is a leather, bossed leather, very elaborate and in absolutely beautiful condition. The one on the bottom left is exactly what it looks like, probably 3.5 inches thick. Those are probably 3/8 inch thick wooden boards with a piano hinge, and then rainbow colored construction paper that makes up the pages. Sewn bindings, as a book conservator, we like those a little better because they're more traditionally made. They're not as common, I think, because they were more expensive to make and because they were hand sewn. So we don't see as many of those, which is a little, they're a little easier to deal with, but not much. And then there's these tied bindings, and I actually think these probably were some of the most common because you could add and subtract pages like you could with the post binding, but it was a little easier. All you had to do was untie the ribbon or the string, or as you see in the bottom right, leather ties were often used. And the covers, so the bottom two have hard covers. The top one was that thick paper cover, but still a very flexible cover, so not that protective. This is the typical damage that you see with tied bindings as well as post bindings because that the leaves are individual and they're held together by something that goes through those holes that doesn't flex. The holes tear out. And you can see, like on the right image, all of those pages were loose. They had just all torn out. So then there's the creator and how that creator had their vision and assembled that vision into these books or albums certainly can cause a lot of problems. They often did cross-page spreads, joining pages together, or creating bulk in that binding gutter that stresses the bindings. And of course, they mixed anything and everything together that, as archivists and preservation-minded people, we know probably shouldn't be next to each other. But they did it anyway, and we love that until we have to actually take care of them. The creator's use of materials that was never meant to be permanent is probably the biggest challenge. Newspaper, it was never meant to last. It's made from the very worst paper ever. Newspaper manufacturers didn't expect you to have to keep those items. And yet, over hundreds of years of newspapers, we certainly have wanted to keep those. So the paper itself is high in wood pulp. It's very acidic. It yellows very badly, and then the inks fade. And I don't know if you can, if I can do this pen. I want you to notice these attached hole protectors. They're little pieces of cloth with a water-activated gummed adhesive on the back. And you can see that somebody at some point added these to this album to protect and reinforce those holes. The creator's choice of the album itself, the support pages that they used, can also cause problems. In this particular case, this was formerly a ledger book that the creator then glued on these newspaper articles that were of interest. And some of them were about this particular person, Scarborough. Others were just interesting articles that seemed to appeal. And so the newspaper articles have damaged the support pages, and you can see that by the acid migration, what we call burning, that's happened on these pages. And you can also see up here in the top right corner that the ink that was on the handwritten ink, which was probably iron gall ink from this period, has migrated through some of the papers, probably from the moisture from the adhesives that were used. They would have been animal hide adhesives at this time, that brown mucilage type stuff. And so that's activated the iron in the ink and has caused it to burn through. This particular book was originally a composition book, a very large one. And its pages were actually quite good. You can see the printing of the lines and etc. down here. And these newspaper articles were then mounted, and you can actually see that they've withstood quite well. Some problematic adhesive coming through here. That's that animal hide adhesive applied very thickly and then aging not well. But overall, this particular choice of support pages was a pretty good one, because this is more than 80 years old and still looks really great. Creators are kind of well known for using anything and everything that's available to them. In this particular case, Manila file folders were used as the support pages. You know, it's endearing, and at the same time, it kind of makes you want to pull your hair out, because how do you deal with that? It was put into a 3-ring binder, and by the time we got it, the 3-ring binder itself was no longer around. But all these objects were still attached, and I have to say, I think that the Manila folder, the composition of it, the folder, it's not that bad, and most of the damage in this is actually from all of the multiple layers of tape. In fact, with this particular album, this is the Reverend Ollie Turner, who was a Baptist minister, and his sister documented his life and travels around the world. And so I believe that over time, I don't know if it was her or family members, continued to add layers of tape to replace or reinforce previous layers of tape. And when we started looking at this scrapbook, we realized that part of the problem was just the thickness of all of those layers, the three-dimensionality. The three-dimensional bulk on these pages was causing a lot of problems to the actual images, and you can see there's some, you can see there's distortion in the photographs from the objects that are underneath, pushing through, and that object being layers of tape. It's very common to see that the creators are writing valuable information about the images or the materials that are added on in this particular case in white ink on very typical black photo album pages. It means that we don't want to get rid of those pages. We don't want to reformat this into a more conservationally acceptable or preservationally sound scrapbook, because we would lose the handwriting that's there, which is a little unfortunate, because these black album pages are very acidic, they're pulpy, they're weak, and they just don't last for a long time. But by removing these photos from the bad support, we would be completely altering the original artifact and the experience of using this scrapbook. And so we really don't want to change that drastically, these objects. This creator wrote information on every album page about who was in the picture and what they were doing and where they were. And so you can see on the right the close-ups of that text kind of in red ink. Again, the support pages are just terribly acidic and very brittle, and they're causing damage to those color photographs. Not so much the black and white ones in the middle. But they still should be retained because of the author information that the creator wrote on there. I love this album. This album was shared between two families. And so the actual album pages themselves, the dark gray paper, was used by one family with images from the 1960s. And then in the 1970s, another family added material onto the spiderweb thin interleaving tissues that were in the album to protect the photos. So the acidic newspaper article about Bobby Darin is now pushing up against the black and white and the color photos on the left. It's causing damage, it's causing acid migration. Those interleaving pages, they're usually transparent, a type of paper, sometimes called vellum. This one is very typical of that spiderweb imprinting. They're very weak, and so in this case, the newspaper article is holding up okay, but when they put heavier Polaroids, the thick little packet of chemical that's got an image in it, those actually then deteriorate and cause the interleaving tissue to tear and weaken. So one solution is to interleave the interleaving, but that's adding a lot of bulk. And so you could do that. In this particular case, you would want to add unbuffered interleaving tissue because of the color photographs. But you have to be very careful not to add too much. So you have to be selective because you don't want to stress the binding. This creator adhered multiple layers onto several pages in this particular album. And so, of course, it stressed it. This overstuffing is not uncommon. How do we deal with that? Sometimes you want to remove some of those items, but does that then alter the story and the experience of seeing what that creator was trying to inform you of? So you want to be very, very careful when you do things like this. This particular creator, Johnny Hudson, was a actor who never spoke in his career. He traveled all around the world. He was famous as Mr. Sorry, I lost that. Anyway, he never spoke. He used a horn, and he also said something like "yeah." But I found this particular scrapbook. This is one of my favorites. To be really fascinating because I didn't know that black actors had to perform in blackface. And he literally went around the world and kept everything that he ever was part of his career, from telegrams to ticket stubs to hotel receipts to boat and train receipts. These telegrams are from, a lot of them are from his agents, but also they're from former fellow actors, congratulating him on wonderful performances all over the world, being in the press, etc. And so they're quite interesting. But he attached them all with flower adhesive, and he kind of was generous in that. And so you can see that in this particular image, some of the information about time and date are missing, or because they're hidden underneath the top layers. We decided that these were they were 1/4 inch thick, and there were 4 or 5 stacks of them on different pages in the album. And so we decided to pull them all out and separate them, and then create new album pages where you could see all of the information. It was a very time-consuming operation, and it added a lot of bulk to the package. But in the long run, we found valuable information up under there that we thought was very important. Intentional use of 3-dimensional objects. You can see this little pipe cleaner addition that has caused damage on the adjacent item, that doily, paper doily. It also, you can see how the little heart-shaped object has fallen into the gutter in this particular one, and that causes a lot of stress on bindings. These are interesting. The pencil, the dance card on the right was actually flopping around and making pencil marks on adjacent items. And then I'm sure we've all seen like examples of what's on the left, the rusty straight pin that held in something, and the fact that they just pierced it through the paper. So what you can't see are the little, hard to see in this image, the little rust spots on the paper, which are only going to get worse. Remarkably, that lacy leaf was intact, which I just find extraordinary. So objects that don't really fit in the text block, and then folding them down in order to make them fit. How do you handle oversized objects? And a lot of times, if you look at the image on the right, you can see that the fold-out, it got folded so many times, and it's such brittle paper that it actually fell out. And the slight fogging of the letters is actually a very simple Japanese tissue mend with wheat paste to hold those little bits back together again. But, you know, that's time consuming, and it requires training, and we don't have those kind of resources available to us all the time. Although I will say that that's a very easy one. You can get training in that really pretty easily. And it is a very economical, small treatment that makes a whopping big amount of difference. And then I just don't even know what to say about this. Obviously, the articles were important in documenting this person's experience, but to just kind of stick them in there and then and then over time they just did this. So what do you do with things like this? Can you pull it out, make a photocopy, put it in a separate folder that's in the same box as this or in an accompanying box? I think you're going to have to weigh your institution's space availability and time, but you don't want to just leave it like this either. You could just note where it came from and what newspaper, and then check online to make sure that those newspaper pages have been microfilmed, and have a note about that. I kind of think that changes the experience of using the scrapbook. So our choice was to pull them out and photocopy them, and then just sleeve the original newspaper pages in polyester sleeves and put them in a large box that lives next to that original scrapbook. But that is, not necessarily the best decision for your institution. And then there's those objects that have to be interacted with. You have to lift the cover or unfold the page, or any number of ways to see the information. Sometimes there's information, I should have mentioned this with photographs, sometimes there's information on the back that you would, like who sent it and where it came from, the date or the occasion, etc. So sometimes removing the tape can allow you to expose that additional information, but they can be problematic. I call these extreme foldouts, where you can see the actually a magnetic sticky album page that originally would have had some plastic on the top of it, and so you couldn't have unfolded and seen who signed the card until you had lifted off the plastic. But then when you fold it out and it folded into the direction of the binding gutter, you just really couldn't have seen all of this information. So how do you handle these? It's always a good question, and I love people's creative solutions to these, so share them if you know. The creators, this is an example of a creator just throwing some images in there. So one thing is, does it belong here? Are those two images of people in those pictures? Sometimes there's no apparent correlation to location, and that might just be actually a random coincidence. They ended up there. We don't know. There is a lot of investigation that can be done. It's time consuming, but it's a great project. I thought when I originally saw this that maybe this handwriting actually referred to that loose image, but going a little deeper, I realized that no, he was actually writing about the original things that were adhered on the page and nothing to do with these two fellows' photographs. So happenstance is what I think is this case. I'm not sure. I think maybe they were fellow soldiers, but I'm not really sure. So investigation is a part of taking care of these items. So I'm going to talk about kind of typical damage, and the main one being inherent vice, one of the main ones, meaning the damage that's going to occur because of the nature of the materials that are being used. Paper, you all know this, paper manufactured from the late 18th century through the 1990s is highly acidic. It's going to embrittle, crack, fade, alter color towards being yellow, particularly newspaper, and then as it's used, it just snaps. And you can see that on the image on the right, where the support page is very acidic, and just by flipping the page, it snapped off. Too much, a bad environment, in this particular case, too much moisture in the air, maybe direct water, although I don't necessarily see evidence of that. But certainly too high humidity has caused the silver mirroring that you see here. So the silver particles in the photograph, so that's a cutout photograph. And the silver particles that make up the image are floating up in the gelatin because the gelatin has become so humidified. And they reach the surface of the image, and then they tarnish. And that's what we call silver mirroring. And you can also see evidence of cockling down here on the bottom right, another indicator of too much moisture. And then the penultimate is, mold growth, which all mean way too much moisture. Again, damage might be because of the highly acidic pages. This is, oops, sorry. This spotting in the photograph, you can see there's quite a bit of it. It is actually loss of image. That could be from moisture, but it could be from other things. So there's a little bit of investigation that needs to go on in order to try to figure out the history of this thing, this object, and where it has lived is going to inform the kinds of damages that you're going to find in these objects. Then there's use damage. And you know, if it's brittle and you're flipping the pages, then the edges are gonna break off. The pages might break at the gutter because the binding is not sufficient for the heaviness of the paper. This cotton tying tape, I almost would call this custodial neglect. So somebody tied this cotton tape on there to hold the loose pages together, which is a good solution, but a little too tight, and it's knifing through the paper. So use and us as custodians can cause problems. This torn photograph, it probably occurred because somebody tried to lift it out of those photo corners, and it's actually glued to those photo corners. The adhesive migrated and adhered onto the photograph itself. We see this a lot because people want to know if there's information written on the back of a photograph. And I don't think it's a bad thing to want to know if there's something back there, but you do need to be very careful and patient when you're pulling on these old photographs. So another environmental issue is light, and the amount of light that an object is exposed to is going to cause a lot of damage, and that damage is irreversible. You will not be able to reverse that. So you want to limit the amount of time that objects are out on display. The conservation standard is not more than 90 days for the life of the object, the entire life of the object. And then you want to keep things in dark storage the rest of the time. So don't just set it on a shelf in a storage area where the lights are on, because that will cause this problem. This is an interesting piece. It was a white lunch bag, and you can see how it's yellowed from the adhesive, but then the white stripe down the center is where a piece of Mylar was laid across it to strap it down. And that Mylar has a little bit of a UV filtering property in it, and so it prevented some UV damage to the paper. And there's nothing we can do about that. Light, I should just say there are 3 kinds of light. There's ultraviolet, the UV, which is the most damaging. Fibers become brittle. Obviously, you see the yellow. Inks fade. Things change colors. You want to, if you can, install UV film, filtering film on windows. And you can also get sleeves that go over your fluorescent light tubes and regular bulbs to cut down on the amount of UV rays that are in the spaces. But visible light, just in general, is harmful, and we rarely hear people talk about it because we don't know how to mediate for that. And the best thing is just install light blocking drapes or shades, and reduce the amount of time that things are in light. Plan exhibits so that items, the more fragile items, can be rotated in and out of an exhibit. So maybe not on display the entire exhibit. Something else can replace, the more fragile items. And if you can, keep light levels low. And the recommended range is between 5 and 15 foot candles. And while 5 foot candles seems very low when you're first walking into a room, you can do that gradually. And I highly recommend that you pay attention to how museums alter your light. Your irises open up as they darken down gradually as you move through exhibits. And to get to the more fragile material at the very end of an exhibit, your eyes have adjusted to the low light levels, and so you don't really notice that it's really only 5 foot candles. And you can do that as well. Pets, obviously, you want to monitor. Sticky traps are a great way of knowing the extent of the problem that you have before you have to call in an integrated pest management vendor. They want to know, this is the first thing they're going to do, so you can start that without having to pay them. Just to know what kind of a problem you have. Is it just spiders, or is it something more pernicious? And then this kind of damage, people often think that's cockroach, but in that particular case, you can see all the bits that are in the gutter of the book, the manuscript part of this, the diary, and it's because they've chewed the pages in order to make nesting material. And then, there's us who cause a lot of damage. And probably the biggest amount of damage that we cause is trying to fix something. And so the era of tapes. This tape is, well, on the image on the right, it's obscuring the actual artifact itself, which is a piece of wallpaper that's been printed as a newspaper. This was common in the Civil War. So you can see multiple layers of tape have been added, and this final one is a medical gauze tape, and that's where that white rubber-based cement adhesive is showing through, and that white stuff is hard, and it's very hard to scrape off. And when you do scrape it off, you risk losing the ink of the printed wallpaper. And then the one on the left is the typical cellophane Scotch tape problem, where it's might be the only thing that's actually holding this document together, but the chemicals have released into the paper, they've cross-linked in the presence of oxygen, the adhesive is failing, it's going to get hard and almost like varnish. It's very expensive to reverse this. Again, obscuring information. You can see the heavy brown paper craft paper tape used to reinforce the binding structure here along this edge. And then on the right, you can see this heavy varnish look, but that's actually the tape chemicals leaving almost a solid layer, and it's actually chipping the paper down. So really unfortunate. And then this are those famous magnetic photo albums that were really common from the 1960s through probably the late 80s. I still think they're out there. I think that a lot of us know better now, but that doesn't mean that stops people from using them. The problem is these adhesive lines of adhesive, that you can see the yellow lines, they're not magnetic, it's adhesive. And that adhesive is migrating through, you can see it altering the actual paper, the letter that's written on that's adhered to it. These are some of the only support pages that I believe should always be replaced. But what this requires is you have to map every page so that you know what was where, and then you have to very carefully lift each item off, and sometimes they are really well adhered, and it's very hard to get them off. But you want to then try to, if you're doing this, how do you recreate the experience of using that original photo album? And that might mean you lay them all out on new pages or put them in Mylar. This particular scrapbook, you saw the cover earlier, was from the career of Robert Churchwell, who was the first Black staff newspaper reporter in Tennessee and Nashville. And he reported on specifically the education in 60s and 70s when, we were all integrating. So it's a fascinating scrapbook. The person who assembled it in his honor upon his retirement gathered all these newspaper articles and then rubber cemented them to the paper, to the pages, which is just construction paper. And that rubber cement, this is exactly what it always looks like. Brown changes to the chemical, and then it fails. It just falls off. And so almost every single thing was falling off of all of these pages. And we found a lot of them up in the gutter, tucked up underneath the post binding. So things that we thought were missing, like these identifying labels of the dates and et cetera, were actually all up in there. And so we had to very carefully, when we unscrewed the post and we're pulling out the screws and then lifting layer by layer, we would find all these little bits up in there, and needed to make sure that they stayed with that page that they had fallen off of. But the good thing was that there was a stain map that we could follow. So the brown stains left behind a trail, and so we could match the staining on the articles versus with the staining on the page, and probably 99% of the articles and materials went back exactly where they had originally been located. And we just used starch paste, wheat paste, to re-adhere everything. So I'll just say a lot of my experience comes from a Save America's Treasures grant that when I was working at Emory we received, and the focus of our grant was to preserve the African American scrapbook collection. We narrowed it down from the hundreds that are in the Emory Libraries collections on this group because they are a underrepresented population, and and they're fascinating. So we decided that we would focus on these. So we went through and we picked actually this scrapbook because it seemed like it was the most straightforward, but in fact it was more than 90 hours of work to take it apart and map and reassemble and then re-adhere everything. And so it was much more than we originally thought. So when I talk later about planning, and one of the documents I'm giving you is how you can proceed to take care of your materials. The first thing is an action plan, and I probably should have put in the document, expect alterations and changes based on actual experience. So we did not expect 90 hours for this album. Again, documentation, a little more on that. You want to develop the different ways you're going to document. So assessment form on this particular image on the right is an example. The treatment levels, level 1, 2, and 3 were just based on time. It kind of goes back to those of you who are familiar with Association of Research Library statistics. Level 1 treatment takes less than 15 minutes to do. Level 2 is 15 minutes to 2 hours, and level 3 is over 3 hours or 2 hours. It was just something I was familiar with, and so we used that, but you certainly would want to develop it for yourself. And by knowing how long something is going to take, you can then put a dollar amount to that, you know, the time that you pay the person to do that kind of work. And that helps in figuring out costs, reporting out, asking for more money, being very realistic in the types of resources that you're going to need. I always recommend for scrapbooks and albums that you digitally document the entire album as you see it when you first start. Don't be doing any treatment or any erasing or mending or removal of anything until after you have documented the way it was, and then you can document every stage in between if you need to. And all of that digital imagery is going to be very valuable in reporting out and helping your administrators understand, you know, why is it taking so long, because you have the document of how many hours it took. But it's also useful for reporting to granting agencies and donors. and that helps them understand your commitment to treating these materials and a reason why you are asking for additional funding. If you have, I spent this much already time-wise on it and it cost me this and I know I need that much more, then you have a very clear evidence of why it's a worthy need. And then also be sure you capture the actual condition. And so get the camera down so that you can see distortion and detaching items. Also, I really believe that digital imagery, the images can be used to reduce usage, actual handling. So you could give digital images when you get a researcher request to do an album, to look at an album that has normally been restricted based on poor condition. So you could give them these digital images, and that might be enough for the information that they're looking for, than to not need to pull the actual item out. But also you can use that digital documentation to help you with PR and media to let people know what it is you're doing. Really high quality digital images can render detail. So if you look at the postmark, you can see that there is actually a date on there that people had not noticed before, and that was very helpful for us. We used an 80 megapixel camera. You know, your phone camera is actually pretty good nowadays, and certainly it's not 80 megapixel, but it can get, you know, you can get pretty good blow-ups, and that's all very helpful. So, oh, and the other thing, so just to go back on these, another thing is that, you know, sometimes when you're looking at photographs, you know there might be more information written on the back of a photograph. And a digital capture of that then helps you, particularly if a photo is loose, you've captured the information that's there so that when you go to readhere that photo back in place, you haven't lost that information. So now on to, you know, additional things that you can do. The main thing is store it better. You want to be aware that vendors like us and our money, and they want to provide us with what we want. So there is now an incredible array of material. Unlike the record boxes, the standard record boxes that we use, it's probably more economical to just buy one or two boxes that fit the actual objects themselves. So, you know, don't buy in bulk, but get it specifically to fit each individual item. In the long run, economically, it's a better fit. It's a better way to think about serving each item. So if you can't get it perfectly custom fit, then you can do things like add tissue or interleaving paper, foam, to build up spacers inside the box to customize it to the size of the object so that it doesn't rattle around in there. Because if you remember that first image that I showed you, part of the damage that occurred to that was because the box was way too big, and as they, you know, we shift in our shelves, we move boxes around, and that thing just flopped around in there, and it just slid, and it created a lot of damage. So you want to try to tighten up the fit even in these boxes. I recommend the two-piece lidded box, and as you can see, there's, I mean, just this one particular vendor had 3 different kinds. So what is the best one for you? And you need to just kind of look at those. The first one, so that you know, B flute is corrugated. So it's a very lightweight box, as opposed to the dark gray barrier board that we're familiar with. It's very stiff and rigid. They both have their value. I personally am a fan for scrapbooks and albums of these drop front boxes because it allows you to slide the item out without having to reach your fingers in and around it, which can cause damage. It's a personal preference, but I thought I'd make a little pitch here. I really do like cotton tying tape when it's used well. I think it's a very inexpensive treatment that you can do that makes a lot of difference in stabilizing an object, and so it doesn't flop around. The covers, the pages don't kind of fall out and get misaligned. I think it can do a lot of good. I'm going to, this my end slide. I want to just say this is an extreme treatment, but this is where we went with our Save America's Treasures grant. Now, granted, we got money. And I should say that there is money out there in granting agencies for all sorts of institutions' capabilities and improving those capabilities. So you don't have to have much to apply for a preservation assessment grant, and they'll give you money that will give you a way to take the first steps forward. But this is what we ended up doing with a lot of the scrapbooks that we were dealing within the Save America's Treasures grant, and that was that we put them in these polyester sleeves that then we bound. And so if you look at the top right corner, you can see that we allowed for a whole lot of space in the gutter so that when the scrapbook in these sleeves was paged through, there was no bending at that shoulder, because you can see that that shoulder, if you look over here, there's a little bit of bending that's occurring right here. And these pages are brittle, and so we learned to increase the amount of polyester that was here so that the actual album page itself did not crack or bend. And just to say, obviously, look at the distortion that the polyester causes. So you don't want to document after the fact because you're not going to capture the items. So you want to capture the items before you put them in the Mylar if you're going to use those digital images for anything. And then you can see, this one in the middle, that the book actually is very stable. We did choose to put everything in a box just for long-term preservation. We didn't have to worry about dust and abrasion and people bumping into them on the shelves and things. But, they're pretty stable. And this is the Ollie Turner one, the one that was the file folders. So you can see the little evidence of the file folder right here. And it was actually a very good solution for this object, which gave us a lot of gray hair. So I'm going to wrap up a little bit here and then take a lot of questions, hopefully. You can see that I did put up a couple of documents for you. It's a little more organized than my talk about what you can do, a little bit about vendors. So do I want to turn it over to you, Angela?
Yes, we can go ahead and do that. Thank you so much, Ann. I think that was just there was so much information packed up in that presentation, and certainly gave me lots of things to think about. If there are any questions from our attendees, you can feel free to type those into the chat box. And as Ann mentioned, there is the URL on her slide here, which I'll also put into the chat box so y'all can get to it later with the 2 documents. That's also where we will put the slides from today's presentation. And I'll include a document with links out to this webinar recording when they are available. So there is the URL.
Can you still hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so I just wanted to say that one of the documents is about the things that you can do with limited resources. And the other one is further reading. So there's been a real upsurge in interest in scrapbooks, preserving scrapbooks and albums, and there's a ton of material out there. So I just kind of put together a little bit of, I thought, information that was a little inspiring and also gave some good practical information that you could follow. But there's a lot more than what is on that other document, the further reading document. So Just so you know, that's what those two documents are. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Okay, so we do have a question. What about photos that came in a stack along with a scrapbook? So they're not necessarily a part of the book, but they are related to the book. How would you go about preserving those?
So if you're sure that they don't actually go into the album, but they are related, I would individually sleeve all of those photographs. You can get sleeves like polyethylene or polyester or polypropylene sleeves are the three good plastics that you can put photographs into. And then you can write or put a label on the outside of on each individual sleeve about that photograph. I personally think it's really important that you number things. So like if you got it in a stack and you know that's the original order, number them that they are in that stack, in that order. And I probably should have mentioned that I do that too with scrapbooks and albums, because we went through and we hand numbered every single page with a very soft pencil so that we were sure that we got them. That was the first thing we did, that we got them back into order once we started taking them apart and cleaning and dealing with things. And then I think myself, I would put the sleeved loose photographs into a box that fits them and just give it an adjacent location on the shelf so that you know that it's affiliated, like say you've got a manuscript number assigned to that album, 1082, then those could be 1082-B so that there's evidence that they go together.
Okay, great. And of course, presumably, you know, they're being described and accessed as a collection, as something that has a relational, you know,
right.
background.
And you put that information in your finding aid as well, so that when a researcher calls it up and you have to go back and find it, and you look at the finding aid, you see that there's multiple boxes that are related.
Thanks, Ann. Okay, we've got a couple more questions. Can you laminate old newspaper clippings to preserve them? I have a 1947 newspaper article with invaluable info on my grandfather and would love to preserve as long as possible. So take it away.
No, so lamination is just putting that nasty tape adhesive chemical in between two layers of plastic. So no, don't do that. It's going to alter it. I can't tell you the number of documents that I've seen in my career that have been ruined by that chemical. So, and you know, it's a proprietary chemical that changes on a monthly basis depending on, you know, what foreign country is in strife, and we can no longer get our chemicals from them like we did last week. So, and because it's proprietary, they're not going to tell you what those chemicals are. They might not know exactly. And they certainly are not going to know how those chemicals are going to cross-link over time. So, no, make a photocopy. You can go now to commercial entities like FedEx and UPS stores and et cetera, Kinko, whatever Kinko's became, and get giant photocopies, or get a big digital image and print it out on an oversized printer. You're better off doing that and printing it onto good paper, paper that's going to last, than trying to preserve it with lamination.
And do you want to talk a second about what good paper means if you're trying to purchase preservation quality copy paper?
Well, pretty much all paper manufactured, if it's newly manufactured since about 2000, it's going to be an alkaline buffered paper, a wood pulp paper. So anything, I would say up until late 90s, you couldn't guarantee that as paper manufacturing, paper plants were changing their processes over to buffered paper, away from acidic paper, inventories hung around. So you could still buy acidic paper, probably even in the early 2000s. But if you're getting paper, fresh paper now, it is alkaline buffered, and it's going to last. And you should also, if you're doing actual printing of these like digital images or your scans, things like that, and you're going to print them out, you should try to match the ink with the paper. The manufacturers really prefer you do this, and you're going to get, my understanding is you're going to get a better result. It might be so discreet that you can't tell the difference, but I'm told that it really does make a difference. So I leave that with you. I'm not really sure, but I think pretty much any copy paper you buy nowadays, so long as you're buying it fresh, is going to be fine.
Interesting. All right, next question is, for the poly encapsulated pages, are they encapsulated all the way around? And also, when you add the additional gutter space, that affects the width of each page, so do you create a new cover or rebind into the original cover with the pages sticking out?
I'm going to start backwards.
Sure.
We separated covers when we did polyester encapsulation. So yes, we made a new cover to fit the bigger object, because there's margin around the edges of the paper and there's all that extra margin in the gutters. We made a significantly bigger object. So we did make new covers. All of those were post bindings, which was really easy. We just drilled through the stack of polyester pages and the covers and added the aluminum screw posts. And then we could also, because we were doing screw posts, we could, if something came up later, we could add new pages in if we had to. And so we wanted to leave that option open for the future of preservation of these objects, because we always assume that things have fallen out and that we might not have had everything that we originally should have had, but maybe it will be found later. And then yes, we did seal all the edges. It's a controversial topic in my world of conservation. I don't think it's really it's not been settled. There's yes and no. Do you leave a corner open so it can off gas? The testing indicates that there's not enough change to a perfectly sealed encapsulation versus a non-sealed encapsulation. So we went ahead and sealed everything. We are very fortunate that at Emory there is a Mentor ultrasonic welder, which is a very pricey piece of equipment, and that's what we use. It's very easy to even make a circular weld around an object. And we didn't have to do that often, but we had that ability. I do not recommend encapsulation with the double stick tape. You still have the problem of the adhesive tape. Eventually the items that are in the Mylar will shift into that adhesive, and then you'll have edge staining and problems. But heat welding, Mylar, those are very economical pieces of equipment, and you can certainly do that, and it's not that hard. It's time consuming, but it's not technically hard to do.
Okay. Have you ever dealt with silk fabric ephemera inserted as part of scrapbook collections?
Oh yeah. So silk is interesting in that it is a protein-based textile and it rots very easily. So hand oil is killer for it. So we had a lot of discussion about whether or not we washed ribbons and things that were silk, because we knew that the hand oil and the dust and the debris was going to, even in the encapsulation, was going to cause deterioration. It's just by the nature of it being silk. We did wash a few things. I have also, in personal projects, washed silk before encapsulating it. It does fine once it's clean and in there. But you do have to be aware that you have to be very careful in putting moisture on silk, because it weakens it while it's wet, and also the dyes can bleed, so you have to be very careful if you're doing it. But I think silk is fine encapsulated. I think most textiles are. The problem is when they get real three-dimensional, like a jacket, a sports, what do you call it, football jacket that's got those big puffy patches. patches on them, and et cetera. So you want to be careful about that three-dimensionality.
Okay. And I've got one more question. So I think we'll be wrapping up soon, but if anybody has any last questions they want to type in, they should feel free. You mentioned Gaylord. What are some other reliable vendors for preservation supplies?
I like archival products. I like university products. I really like Talus. I'm trying to think if I've got others. I did put everybody on the list that I think is kind of common on one of the documents, and I think I forgot university product, which I should apologize publicly to them for, because I'd like them. I think you have to be a wise shopper. They each have what I like to call loss leaders. So they're going to get you in with an inexpensive product, and then you're going to get all the rest of your items from them, but they're going to be more expensive. So I would say compare prices, get what you need at the best price. Make sure that you factor in how expensive shipping is, because I can tell you that shipping out of New York for Talus is pretty pricey. So you think you're getting a cheaper product than at another vendor, but then the shipping cost is going to make it go up. So be careful for that. I do think you can get a lot of materials at art supply stores if you're wise, like using I talk a lot about dry cleaning and using a white acrylic eraser. Well, there's no reason to order those online unless that's the best way for you to get your supplies at your institution. You could just go and spend 59 cents at the art supply store, because they'll have them.
Well, I do want to mention, because I've received this question myself in other arenas, that while you can find those cheaper things at art supply stores, they are often tricky with their labeling and will sometimes call, archival photo corners with adhesives on the back. And it's like, you just have to be wise about what you're buying.
Exactly. I would say that about any of the vendors that I have mentioned, that you still have to be wise. And they are vendors, and they want to sell you what they think you want. So you have to be very knowledgeable about the product that you actually want and whether or not you're going to get that. Don't be fooled by the word archival. It has absolutely no meaning. There's no definition. And, I could call the chip paint on the house next to me archival if I wanted to. It's like the word natural and light in the food industry. They have no meaning. So be very aware of what it is you want. Do you want buffered, which means it's got a pH of above 7.5? You don't want to go too high in buffering. So I've seen products that are buffered up to 9. That's way too high for most of our materials. Acidic, and some materials live fine in acidity. Some materials like silk and color photographs do better in acidity than they do in alkalinity. So you want to use unbuffered materials, which have a relatively neutral pH, with color photographs and those Polaroids, and definitely fabrics, silk and wool, and etc. Cotton can withstand some alkalinity, but do you know what that object is made out of? And go err on the side of the general if you don't know for sure.
All right, and I think this will be our very last question. So I am new to my position. The previous archivist put the entire scrapbook in polyester sleeves. Will the scrapbook continue to deteriorate?
That's a tough one. Is your environment good? Is it, in a dark storage box? Does it get brought out and used a lot? It kind of depends. I would say that polyester sleeves can protect from hand oil, and they offer a lot of support when you're turning pages. If the pages have three-dimensionality to them, the polyester sleeves they're not very forgiving for three-dimensionality, and so they crush the corners, and the edges. They kind of because the polyester is tight at the edges. So it depends. And the other question is whether or not they're open on one side. And so if that's the case, that certainly is a point where dust and pollution, from our air, if you're anywhere in the Atlanta metro area, it's very polluted. Here we have that as a consideration for our collections. The intake on our HVAC systems brings in all of those pollutants. And so if your sleeve is open, it's exposed to that. So I think you need to look at your environment and how the object is being used, and maybe just pay attention to it closely. You'll have time as you're new in your career. You'll have time to spend some time with that object.
All right, Ann. Well, thank you again for today's presentation. To our attendees, you can see both of our email addresses on this final slide here, so please feel free to get in touch if you have further questions. When we close out of this presentation, you will be directed to a survey that we hope you will take a couple of minutes to complete. And that concludes today's presentation, so thank you again for joining us.
Thank you all.